The glory of humanity is the differentiation, individuality of each person, and the fact that each individual is unique and irreplaceable, which makes each individual precious.
I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about two classes of Americans, and it may not be the two classes you think of, but nonetheless, there are two distinct classes in America, and we have to break up.
You don't get freedom peacefully. Anyone who is depriving you of freedom isn't deserving of a peaceful approach.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being by any means necessary.
Welcome to the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast, a Utah-based program that focuses on ideas, politics, culture, and the current events going on in the world around us, whether locally or globally. I'm your host, David Iglesias. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast. I'm your host, David Iglesias, and today we have, of course, another incredible guest, always top quality guests on this show for everybody. Today we have Leslie Corbly from the Libertas Institute. Leslie, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So today we're going to talk about all things privacy, especially as it pertains to more of the digital realm of things and what that looks like and how there's an important balance between, what information the government has access to and, how do people maintain privacy. But why don't you kind of lay out for people what it is you do at Libertas? What's your job? You're a policy analyst, but what does that mean and what are your focuses?
Sure. So I focus on privacy, particularly privacy as it relates to individual rights and how to maintain individual rights in an increasingly digital world. So specifically wanting to look at how we ensure that the principles of our Constitution carry over into today. So for instance, the Fourth Amendment is a good example of this. The Fourth Amendment was predicated on some fantastic principles, but it has been eroded over time. The case law has created a lot of exemptions for warrantless searches and whatnot, and that creates just an exposure for people to be able to, for their information to go to government officials, perhaps when it shouldn't, or for law enforcement to have more broad ability to search than they should. Mm-hmm. So that's just an example on the legal front of privacy, but there are concerns aside from pure Fourth Amendment, but primarily what I look to do is to ensure that government cannot access your information without following the correct protocols, which is the Fourth Amendment. Right. That's the whole point of having it. So
maybe because I'm kind of assuming that a lot of my listeners, or a fair amount at least, aren't quite familiar with the amendments and what's the Fourth Amendment. Everyone kind of knows the First Amendment is free speech, Second Amendment is gun rights and all that stuff. But can you maybe go into a little bit of detail, just kind of simplistically, what is the Fourth Amendment? What does it talk about? We're alluding to privacy, but what is its purpose?
So the Fourth Amendment reads, the right of a person of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So essentially what that lays out is that you would not have unreasonable searches. Now, I would argue, again, with the erosion over time, that we have crept over that line, and there's much more, a lot more tactics law enforcement can use to obtain information that they otherwise wouldn't under the original meaning, which is more or less what I just described to you. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the 70s, there were a line of cases that allow law enforcement to have access to information once it's been transferred to a third party. So this relies on both the third party doctrine and the idea that if there's no quote unquote societal reasonable expectation of privacy, then the search itself is not unreasonable. So these are judicial creations, and I would argue that they're not in the best interest of the public, as far as I don't think that's a great place for the jurisprudence to go. I respect our judges, of course, but would take issue with the notion that a societal expectation of privacy that's ever evolving is what governs whether or not a search is reasonable or not. So that's one of those things that's eroded over time. And then, of course, as well, the third party doctrine, which essentially piggybacks off of that, or not piggybacks off of it, but is very interconnected with the reasonable expectation of privacy, essentially stating that once your information has flowed to a third party, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy because you've handed that information over to a third party. So this is problematic for several reasons, particularly in the digital age where almost all information is transferred to a third party. You can't really like operate on the internet without transferring your information to a third party. So that's exactly what happens as information is transferred to a third party, and then law enforcement can request that information, and they don't have to use a strident of requirements as the Fourth Amendment would require. So for instance, geo-fence warrants are an example of this. That's where law enforcement will draw like a virtual boundary over a real geographic area, and then send requests to Google saying, we want all user information in this area. So as you can see there, that's a general warrant. So that's actually the exact type of warrant the Constitution was designed to prevent against. So general warrants are what would be considered a fishing expedition. That's where they're just gathering information. They don't really have a suspect in mind. A crime generally has been committed. So oftentimes it's something like a carjacking is just an example. So it's not as if a crime hasn't been committed, but part of the problem is that they're using this on the front end of their investigation to find a suspect rather than having a suspect in mind. Let's say, hypothetically, we think you, David, were guilty of the carjacking, and we have, probable cause to believe that. Then going through the warrant process would be completely different than if you just say, there was a carjacking, we have no clue who did it. We want everyone's data in this radius to try to find our suspect.
Right. And so it's interesting because that makes me think of, so to kind of like simplify it even more for some people, it's basically because the general idea, like you laid out at the beginning, is the police are supposed to get a warrant before they go kick down anyone's door, before they do any real investigations of like trying to find certain people, or they have to have a certain item or list of things that they're looking for. That's generally the case. That's why when the police show up at your door, they're not allowed to enter your home without probable cause, without a warrant, because otherwise it would just be the police could come in and go through your house whenever they want. And I think most people would agree that wouldn't be okay. Now with the geo-fences, it's a whole other ballpark, because now it's just almost guilt by association. And there's actually I was reading, there's a set of different Supreme Court cases, but there's one, I think it was Ibarra versus the US, where basically the police had gone into a bar and they were looking for the restaurant or the bar owner, but then they patted down everybody. The warrant that they had nothing to do with anybody else, just the bar owner and the bar. But they patted down everybody, and this guy whose last name is Ibarra, they found drugs on him, but he was not listed under the warrant. And so it brought up this question of, can you just start investigating people because they're associated, because they happen to be at the wrong place with the wrong time? And that's exactly what the geofence warrant is, except even worse, because there's no particulars other than, we know the crime was committed, like you said, and we know that, they probably had a cell phone, so Google probably has a way to track them. So let's just, like a fishing expedition, exactly like you said, just round up every single person in this geographic area. Is that kind of a fair summation of how that works?
It's certainly I would have to read that specific case, but I do wonder if Terry stops were involved. So Terry stops are, again, another carve out to the Fourth Amendment, where law enforcement is allowed to pat down an individual if they have, I believe it's a reasonable suspicion that that the officer themselves are in danger. So if someone has potentially could have a gun, things like that. Again, I haven't read that case in a while, so I'd have to go back to that. But at any rate, that's just another, almost like another bucket of concerns with the Fourth Amendment would be things like Terry stops, which were not common prior to, I believe it's either the 1960s or 70s. I can't remember which decade those rulings came down in, but again, those were not common prior to that, where you could just stop someone on the street. And often it was associated with drug crimes. It was very often there was a call for something kind of like what we described, drugs, a carjacking or mugging, like something more in that line is what, which would, again, there's an understandable, it's not as if these cases, you can't kind of understand the reasoning the judges used to get there, in the sense that law enforcement's job in some ways as time has progressed has become more difficult. So it's not really like an against law enforcement thing as much as it is we need to preserve the Fourth Amendment and the principles for which it's stood, not because we want to make law enforcement's job more difficult, but because we respect the underlying principles and believe that we err from those principles to our peril. So it's really not designed to sort of intentionally, oh man, we just want to make your job more difficult because that's fun. That's really not the goal. The goal is much more to preserve these principles. And the reality is that law enforcement, in my view, has been acting outside of these principles for, I mean, decades now. It's been quite a while since we've had carve-outs, increasing carve-outs for Fourth Amendment. Although, again, the tide may turn. I think justices are becoming aware of the dangers associated with the internet. You've seen some favorable Fourth Amendment rulings, so that's helpful. I think legislatures have a role to play. The legislative process, I think, absolutely has a role to play in protecting privacy and in upholding these principles. We can't really leave this just to judges. Just by the nature of the way the judicial system works, it lags behind any kind of technological advances, because to get a case in front of the Supreme Court is so difficult. You have to have the right fact pattern. It has to make its way through the appellate process, and then that's just going to be pretty narrow. So that's where legislation can draw better boundaries often than judicial rulings, which is why we support reforms such as ensuring that in order to obtain, so for instance, with geo-fences, ensuring that there's a Fourth Amendment protection before they can obtain that information. Again, it's not saying law enforcement shouldn't be able to obtain information on an individual. It's saying you need probable cause, you need particularity, you need to know what it is you're actually seeking to obtain, not just these broad, we want everyone's information in just geographic region. This is very broad, again, would constitute a general warrant. And there have been some judges, there was one in Kansas and I believe elsewhere, that have kicked back these warrants, saying that they're not valid, that they violate the Constitution, that they're concerned. Essentially, so what happens mechanically when a law enforcement officer is seeking a warrant is they have to file an affidavit with the judge. So the warrant does have to be signed. And that's, again, where you get some confusion with these warrants, because once they've issued the warrant, it has been signed by a judge, which makes it at least to most lay people, they go, oh, that's a warrant. It was signed by a judge, right? That's what most people think constitutes a valid warrant, is it was signed by a judge. And that's a fair point of confusion if you haven't gone beyond that to read really what constitutes a valid warrant is not just that a judge signed off on it. But so some judges have actually kicked back those affidavits saying you're going to need to give us more specific information before we can sign these warrants. So it's not as if there's no dispute in the legal community surrounding these warrants. It's just that they're broadly used right now because the landscape is favorable to government agents using them that way. I mean, that's just the bottom line, is there's nothing really preventing most, I mean, unless you have a specific judge say no, by and large, they can submit these warrants and expect them to be honored. So that's kind of where we're at right now with these sort of general broad warrants. And just so your listeners know, it's not as though these geo-fence warrants are the only type of warrant. So that's what's called a reverse warrant, which means, again, you're seeking broad information. So this could be done for keyword searches. You could ask for keyword searches in a specific geographic region if there was reason to do that, if law enforcement believed that was helpful for their investigation. There are now search engines that use facial recognition to identify faces. So you can crawl the internet. Let's say we wanted to search for a specific individual's face, you could kind of in a way track them and see where they were at different times. So there's lots of different like search engine activity that you could apply a reverse warrant to. So it's not really as though this only comes down to geofences in Google. That's just a good example because it's happening a lot right now, and also because Google is so large that they're one of the primary targets as far as receiving these warrants, because they have so much information. But it's not as though this is a problem that's limited to that, nor is it one that is going to go away anytime soon, which is one of the reasons that I believe legislation is necessary in this realm, because the courts aren't going to be able to address this problem with any degree of speed. That's just not how the judicial process works. But it's also not 1960 anymore. We have different problems that we need to address, and some of these legal doctrines that came out decades ago, I think are proving to have unintended consequences or allow unintended actions that aren't in the best interests, not only of the public, but also I do think I think that they violate the underlying principles of the Constitution that are really important for us to uphold, because again, I think those principles are applicable today.
Yeah. And one of the hard things, and this was another thing I was reading and like doing when I was doing some research on this whole thing, a lot of, I mean, you have these judges and these people that have been in the courts and the legal system for decades, right? And they have existed before all the new technology, and so you probably, odds are you're going to get a judge. So with the geofence, I hate like going back to the same thing, but it's such a good clear example. um like with the geofence, a judge probably, I was reading that they sometimes don't even see the map. They don't see the geographical area. So maybe there's a bank robbery, and then the map that the police are using includes the bank and then a residential neighborhood and then two more stores right next to the bank. So it's like this big circle, but the judge doesn't see that sometimes, or the judge doesn't understand, how technology works. And because I didn't even know this, and I'm a younger, tech savvy person allegedly. But like, for example, when it comes to GPS, when it comes to location tracking, that which Google uses, just because someone pings up in that circle, like, so if people imagine there's a circle, or imagine like the square on this screen, just because someone pings up in this this geographical area doesn't actually mean they could be in there. They might actually be farther away. It's just the GPS system kind of gives an accuracy assessment, and depending on how accurate, like, kind of determines how big the ping is. So they might be really, way far away from this geographical section, but they're going to ping inside of it just because the accuracy isn't really that good. But a judge doesn't know all those details, and so it makes it very difficult to apply these principles on privacy, property rights, things like that. How do you carry that over into the tech world? Because again, it's playing catch up. That's why they're so slow with these issues. Is it's not necessarily that they're dumb or bad people. It's just the speed at which technology moves and the knowledge that people have that are experts in the legal world. I mean, it's not their job per se to be the most tech savvy people, right?
There's definitely a I agree with you. This certainly has nothing to do with their intelligence levels
Right.
at all, or anything related to that. There's definitely a disconnect as far as understanding particularly how the technology works in some cases. I think some justices and judges obviously are more plugged in with that than others. But more broadly, the problem, so like to make the problem a little more crystal clear, so first of all, there's a difference in the accuracy rates of geofence or any kind of like geolocation device, depending on whether you're asking. So like hypothetically, if the law enforcement officer were asking Google versus a telephone company, you're going to get a different accuracy rate. I believe Google's is actually more accurate because the
Right.
towers, I don't think, have as accurate of a radius as far as where you exactly are. I think that has something to do with just, I don't understand much of the mechanics specifically of how
Right.
either of them gather that information, but my understanding is that Google's a little more accurate, which actually makes sense because I imagine that they would need to be, that Google would need to be more accurate because they're actually providing a GPS system, whereas phones are just pinging, right, to connect to other devices. So I imagine that the geographic accuracy would be more important given that they run Google Maps. But aside from that, it's clear that there's accuracy differences depending on the service provider you're requesting information from. And then aside from that, you have the reality that so not every investigation is equal in a sense. And I think it's easy to forget that. So if you're searching for a carjacking suspect, you're not going to have a high likelihood of identifying a bunch of wrong suspects and charging them all with a crime, right? Because only realistically, you're going to want to find whoever did the carjacking or broke into the home or something that's more in that nature. So that has to do with how specific the crime is. So the more specific the crime is, the less dangerous in a sense these warrants are. Now, that does not make them constitutional. I'm just saying the likelihood of abuse is less dangerous because you would have to go to more effort to sort of concoct a case against an innocent party. So again, it's not that it can't happen. There have been innocent individuals charged with all kinds of crimes. So I'm not trying to suggest it can't. But let's say you go to a crime that's much more difficult to even define. And in particular, this is where you get something that could be politically motivated and could be very dangerous to the cohesion of our like just public life in general. As we know, we're already highly polarized people, very split between left and right. It's already difficult enough for anyone really in society to see the other side, so to speak, in a positive light, which is not helpful for anyone involved. So in protests, for example, in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests in Minnesota, geofence warrants were widely used to try to identify protesters who may have committed crimes. Now, again, this is where you're going to get a bigger problem. At what point, for instance, does a protest turn into a riot or turn into criminal activity? That's not clear, often because there's a lot of people in one geographic region. You don't know what motivated each individual to arrive there. You don't know who came with criminal intent, and it's not necessarily clear at what point any given individual actually violated a law versus was just simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. So these same warrants were used against protesters in Minneapolis and elsewhere in the following George Floyd's death, and of course very aggressively against those who were at the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. Now, these things become much more important because it is much easier to, so as we, I don't know to what degree your listeners are aware, but the plea bargaining system in law enforcement can be very aggressively used, or the plea bargaining system in prosecutor offices can be aggressively used. Again, this depends on the prosecutor. It's not consistent necessarily across different geographic regions of the US, but we know that statistically most defendants plea out because it's very difficult to mount a defense. And that, again, these factors become much more relevant when you're dealing with crimes that are difficult, that are much more broad, that are easier, where it would be easier in a way to pressure someone to want to plea out because they're being charged with a very sort of, particularly if you're, particularly in the case of January 6th defendants, that's a very damages your reputation heavily. I would say more so than in other protest movements. Not to say that anyone wants to be charged with, a crime of like property damage or so on and so forth, but they've been more aggressive in the charges against January 6th defendants.
You aggress against the state, the government, and they will come down harder for just simply trespassing versus burning down someone's building.
It's a little different when you're being charged with sedition, is what I mean, or when that's on the table. So obviously I'm not trying to make broad commentary on the prosecutorial conduct. That's not really what I'm trying to speak to. More speaking to the danger associated with let's say you locate a bunch of individuals who may have been involved. Again, the only thing they can identify at this stage is that you may have been involved in committing a crime because they're only placing you near the scene of a crime. They actually haven't determined anything particular to that individual. And the degree to which they actually have to determine something particular to that individual is going to depend on a lot of other factors, such as what other evidence they have. Honestly, things come in that you kind of wish didn't, but things like, does the prosecutor's office know they have a favorable jury pool to prosecute this? Do they know that? These are all factors that come into both prosecutors' minds and a defense attorney's mind when they're giving advice to a client. Okay, if I think that you have virtually no shot at winning this, I may, a defense attorney may be more likely to say it's in your best interest to plea out.
Yeah.
If you're a first-time offender, maybe that means you'll just have, you'll just be on probation and your life will go easier. So again, these factors all come in. And because they come into each specific case, that's why I'm saying I'm not trying to make any broad statements regarding how these investigations were done. It's more the danger of using these reverse warrants to identify potential suspects before you really have any reason to believe someone's involved in a crime, right? You're not going to the public first. You're not requesting. It's been common for a long time for law enforcement to request, information from the public if they're trying to find a suspect of a crime. That's pretty common. Right. But these are encouraging them just to use raw data points, and it's not clear the extent to which, you could mix and match, I assume, these methods, right? I want geo-fence data. I want reverse keyword searches on those same users, right? How much of this information can you get sort of aggregated so that you can begin to almost profile people before they are even aware that they're under investigation?
Yeah, you've
Like
already built a case ready to slam them
yeah,
before they
it's
even
almost like
knew.
you can do that, right? Like you can do that, and at least it's far easier. You have there's more tools available for law enforcement to do that now than there would have been before. Again, I'm not trying to paint law enforcement with a broad brush or prosecutors' offices or anything akin to that. It's going to depend on where you're specifically located, but this does have undermined, I believe, these tactics and the use of these broad warrants that are fishing expeditions undermines the public's trust in government. I mean, it really does. I mean, you can't be a layperson and not reasonably look at this and think, wow, okay, that's a lot of power you have, and you don't know when it's being exercised, and you don't know what's happening with your data, and you don't necessarily know who has access to what. So I believe it was Pew that just did a survey on Americans' views on privacy, and there are more concerns than have been previously noted as far as what's going on with my data, fears of being tracked. I believe it was a majority of the country, or a majority of those surveyed, let's put it that way, that said they did think that their information is being stored and tracked by either corporate or government entities. And it's not irrational for them to think that at this point. There is a lot of, now that doesn't mean your information is being personally looked at every day, of course, but again, it's this environment that's much less stable as far as your actual ability to control your identity and how that is presented to the world in a way.
Right. It creates a more paternalistic government, which is very disturbing in the sense of they know they might, like, it's kind of like you said, it's not that they're actively looking at your information every single day, studying you.
No.
Unless you become a target, then they will. But it's the fact that they have those, like, they have access to everything they need. So at the moment they decide, hey, let's start, this is a threat. And this brings up a really good, you've already started talking about it to a good degree, but so for me personally, and on the show, I've addressed a lot of foreign policy issues and concerns on the war on terror and what the government does overseas and all the things that they do, which I would argue are largely crimes, and they should be held on trial for all those things. But it seems to me, and I think a lot of people are feeling this way, that war on terror is turning inwards domestically, and so now it becomes a question of what is a terrorist, what constitutes as an act of terror, and who is it against? Because I would say since 2020 up until now, we've had a perfect example of how arbitrary it can be to define what is a domestic terrorist. If you're on the left wing, it's like you said, it's a completely political weaponized tool. And so on the left wing, they're going to target people who are Trump fanatics, who like and supported Trump, because Trump is I think it's today they're actually starting to do all the January 6th trials that are airing and for people to watch or whatever. But if you're on the left wing, you look at that whole situation and you look at those people as potential domestic extremist terrorists. If you're on the right wing, you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at these people who maybe are more concerned about civil liberties, and there are a lot of insane people, and I am very critical of that side of the aisle, but there are also very good people. I know very well-meaning people who just, they would be at an event, they would be at a protest just because they're not political, but someone's telling them, hey, you're against black people being beat up, you should come. So they go. But then anyone on the right wing is going to largely look at, all right, who was there? They're a potential target. So now it's not a question of, it's not easy to say, well, that person broke into a car, so they're a criminal. It's now, I don't like what they did, and now the government has the tools, depending on whoever is in that seat of power, to swing the stick in the direction they want. And it seems like everything's extremely polarized, but we've had these two like black and white areas of January 6th and then the summer of love or whatever, with all the riots, protests, whatever you want to call them. And it's just like so apparent that there's not, like, people are not living in the same reality, and therefore their definitions of what an extremist and what a threat is is very different. And then once you have this centralized power that has access to everybody's information, access to where everybody has been, what everybody has been doing. And I mean, you just have to look at, even before this, the Edward Snowden leaks were a massive revelation on how involved the government is on spying on people. And so that, I think, is a really huge concern, that you've been alluding to, about this whole domestic terror concern on that front.
Sure. So there's some good jumping off points there. First, I'm going to go ahead and actually just read the definition of domestic terrorism as defined in 18 USC section 2331,
Okay.
subparagraph 5. So the term domestic terrorism means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the U.S. or of any state, and activities that appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce of the civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the U.S. So as you can see, that's a very broad definition. You're defining domestic terrorism as a violation of the criminal laws of the U.S. or any state. That means any violation of state's criminal code could constitute domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
You also have appear to be intended. What does appear to be intended? There's a lot of, these are very broad, not specific laws that have, there's a lot of room for interpretation. And the more vague a law is, again, that's where I was trying to get your listeners to understand some of this danger comes from definitional issues, right? Of like, okay, the more broad a law is, to some degree, the more likely it is to be abused.
Right.
Because and that's just how the human brain works to some degree. That's not necessarily a corrupt thing. I mean, you could be a prosecutor and have the best zeal to do the right thing, and when you have an overly broad law, it sort of incentivizes you to potentially prosecute more because it's a broader law. It's easier to prosecute more. Okay, I think this has appeared to be intended, right? Because what a prosecutor is doing when they have a case come before them is they're determining whether whether or not there is enough evidence for them to convict. So if you have a broader law, it's going to be easier for you to say there's more, right? So that's just a problem with the definition. I think is very broad, and it lends itself to that, to kind of what you just described, which is it's going to be easier to fit your preconceived biases into the law if you in those circumstances, right? Okay, I see people burning a building, let's come down really hard on them, right? Whether or not those individuals were actually involved in that is going to be easier, or the same with January 6th. So some of it is for sure both the definitional aspects. Civil libertarians were on the forefront of this even during the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, where they said it's really where we're headed is dangerous right now, and they were right. In my view, it is dangerous to say we're going to start, sort of curtailing civil liberties, being more willing to track people abroad for fear of another attack. We're really going to start down this road of more easily violating civil liberties. So you got things like the Patriot Act, and yeah, so there's a lot of problems there, and it does lend itself to abuse. Just the way the system is set up, it lends itself for that. So it's not fantastic. I don't like it. I think it's definitely time for more individuals concerned about civil libertarian issues to speak out and to be willing to really take a hard look at these issues. And it's not about whether you like the way a specific protest went or not.
Right.
That's not the point. The point is that we need to follow the law and follow the principles of the Constitution and ensure that our civil liberties are protected, and that actually has real meaning. And it doesn't just mean, you'll hear a lot of like what I view as like almost double speak. Oh, we have the government disinformation board, but we're going to protect your civil liberties. That's like a core tenet of what we do. So you have this weird like pay lip service to these rights, but then sort of do the total opposite. It's like, it's sort of hard to take seriously in certain regard. So So yeah, I think it's part of it's definitional on the front end that domestic terrorism absolutely could be turned inward, because it's so broadly defined. It's everything that's bad. I
Yeah.
mean, you look at something like, oh, it appears to be intended to intimidate or to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. At what point does a protest become intimidating, for
Well,
instance?
we just
Like,
had
we don't know.
the other week there was those people protesting outside, or a few days ago protesting outside Kavanaugh's house. When does
Yeah.
that? So then, whoever's in charge, well,
I,
isn't that free speech? You get to criticize. I mean, let's just flip the roles, because this is about, I think, Roe v. Wade, right? In this
yeah.
scenario.
Hmm.
Well, what if it was about gun laws? What if that was one of the more
Well,
left leaning judges, and they were saying this judge was going to come down on gun law? So it's kind of like, that, where does it become terrorism? Where does it become?
the same thing happened, though. I mean, it's the same issue that's happening at the school board level. I don't know if you saw the
Mhm.
story on the FBI. This
Parents
concern.
are terrorists.
Yeah, but it's the same thing. Like, there were a lot of COVID protests outside of, like, school
Hmm.
board members' homes and things during COVID. So these heated things occurring are 100% happening in multiple areas on multiple issues. And it's not clear at what point it becomes intimidation. Now, I personally don't think protesting in front of someone's home is like great form or going to get your movement a lot of praise. I don't think you're really helping yourself in that regard,
Hmm.
but that doesn't make it illegal.
Right.
Like we have to, and so these kind of conversations, I think, are finally in some way being had. I don't think that most people were even aware of what domestic terrorism could even possibly constitute 10 years ago. I don't
Right.
think anyone was thinking
No,
in those terms.
they're
So
thinking of people that go and blow up, random buildings. They're thinking, because that's what the government painted was, oh, it's probably some Middle Eastern looking person who's gonna
yeah,
have a
yeah,
bomb or come in with a gun. That's what they
yeah,
imagined domestic
yeah.
terrorism was. Now it's not. That's not the image people think of anymore. It's usually an American citizen who, it was at the wrong place at the wrong time, doing something that someone didn't like, and so yeah, it's a very dangerous game to be playing, and to put that solely in the hands of the government to be able to determine all those things. That's the concern, and that's largely the work that you do. So I kind of want, I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of like the craziness, some of the scary kind of aspects of it. But fortunately, this is a Utah centric podcast, so I try to always tie in or focus on what I can with Utah. So the think tank that you work for is the Libertas Institute. It's a Utah-based think tank, and that team works to influence the policies that are made in Utah. And fortunately for Utahns, there's been relatively a lot of wins and progress in terms of protecting the privacy of Utahns when it comes to Utah government and law enforcement. Can you maybe speak a little bit to what are some of those wins? What is the work that you guys have done accomplished in that end?
Sure. So we passed a law that requires a warrant before electronic data can be obtained. So that's a big one, to try to undercut, again, to try to curb that third party doctrine. And that's where I sort of had tried to mention that there's a difference between the judicial and legislative roles. So the judiciary just has a completely different role in our governmental system than the legislature. So if they say you're constitutionally allowed to do this many actions, the legislature can say, no, now you're only allowed to do this. So they can
Right.
limit it by statute, right? So there's nothing stopping states from saying, great, the Supreme Court said you can access that without a warrant, that doesn't violate the Constitution. Well, we're going to create a statute that says that's a no-go. You can't do that, right? So that's kind of where those different roles come into play, because you really can't, in my view, rely too heavily on one branch of government to solve some of these problems. They're very complicated and nuanced, and it can be very difficult to overturn longstanding jurisprudential doctrines, which is, by the way, a good thing by and large. You don't want it to be super easy for those doctrines to flip like switches. It can be
Right.
really confusing. So I'm not here trying to just undercut all of stare decisis and say we should just stop doing that at all. I understand why it's difficult to overturn cases, or to overturn past precedent. So there is a role for legislature to play. So that's one big win we had, is ensuring that that when law enforcement is seeking electronic data, they have to follow the Fourth Amendment and get a
Right.
valid warrant. So we also this past 2022 session the Department of Health, and this is one I don't think most people would even have in their brain. And that's where it's important to understand how broad data is. It's really important to understand. Like it's pretty much anything that any information about you will end up in a database, right? At the end of the day, even if you're filling out a paper form, that information is it's not just going to stay on the paper form. So the Department of Health here in Utah was requiring women, once you had like given birth, so you've just gone through labor, they were requiring women to fill out a 100-question survey before they could even apply for their child's birth certificate. So this survey is asking primarily research questions that has nothing to do with actual, identifying documents.
Yeah.
I mean, it's asking things like your use of prenatal vitamins, your use of contraceptives, whether or not you had Zika, I believe was on there, and whether or not you used surrogate services. So these aren't like particularly relevant to your child's identifying information, right?
Right.
And so that's kind of, we created a law, or the legislature passed a law that we very much supported. We didn't create the law, but the legislature did, and we very much supported it, which would ensure that there is a clear delineation on these forms between the voluntary information you can provide and the information that you have to provide in order for the Department of Health to process your request. So certain information you have to provide for them to be able to to hand out a birth certificate. It's basic information, primarily like name, address, who your parents are, the child, the date of the child was born, things like that is what would go into the actual request. And then separately labeled in bold letters should be a
do not have to.
You can fill this out and it's voluntary, right? Like voluntary information that you don't have to provide. So that's kind of was what the legislation required, is that there a clear delineation between voluntary and mandatory information. And then it also allowed a process for individuals, because this program, I want to say this had been implemented for quite a number of years before this law was passed. So if someone wants to remove their information from the data set, they're allowed to. There's a process for them to do that. But essentially what was happening before this law was researchers were then paying for that data at different research universities and then accessing the data. So from time to time, the form would actually be updated to change. It would appear likely that was, oh, we want this information for research. Again, that's you can't prove that, but it's, why is your form changing? This is bizarre. So that's an example of a non-law enforcement, again, which violates informed consent. But that's not a law enforcement issue. So again, whether government is involved with the acquisition, storing, or distribution of data is where I'm concerned, right? Because there's potential for problems, but of course on the law enforcement side, and I think most people sort of intuitively understand that when a criminal law is involved, there's just a lot of danger. But on the civil side, there's also a lot of the government's involved in a lot.
Baby's birth certificate if you don't answer 100 questions.
Well, there's a lot of coercion that can happen, right? Yeah, of coercing you into actions you may not otherwise really want to take that are kind of beyond the scope of providing a public service, right? I mean, yes, we want the government I think most of us want birth certificates to be issued. I don't think anyone's really questioning whether or not we should we should be issuing birth certificates so that people can prove their identity. Like that's a good thing. We all want that. But you shouldn't be coerced into taking a bunch of other steps purely because you need this document, right? I mean, you can't. What are you going to do if your child doesn't have a birth certificate? Like,
they can't do anything.
Like you kind of need that. That's pretty important information for your child. So again, it's when government is, and think of how broad government services are now. I mean, it covers a lot. So these issues of of coercion and whatnot become much more important when you're looking at how much government is involved in our lives. And I think that's one of my reasons for really not wanting government involved nearly as much as they are. I don't think they're competent to solving the problems they want to solve. I think they often make things worse, make more of a muck of things than when they started. So there's a lot of concerns with that, but that's again a different rabbit hole of like to what extent should government be involved in the day-to-day workings of individuals' lives.
Right. At best, it at best case scenario as far as inconveniences, it's making people's lives more frustrating, difficult, time consuming. Worst case, it's actually destroying lives. And so it's the work that's being done with from people like you is trying to make sure that we're removing as many of those hurdles and as many of those threats as possible. Another one that I thought was really interesting as far as Utah goes, and I think you've already mentioned a little bit about like some of the third party stuff, but here in Utah, people are huge fans of genealogy and love doing genealogical, is that the word, work. And so you have companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, I think is the big one here that was like, and so that's one that a lot of people, I mean, this deals with DNA, and that's really interesting, and it gets into some very curious areas as far as principle, like, you know, property rights or whatever, because me putting in my DNA doesn't only give access to my DNA, it gives access to my family's DNA. And they don't even have, like, without their consent, me sending in something to 23andMe or Ancestry, now their DNA is up and available. And so now there's the question of, and I think I'm confident that you guys did work on some of the DNA questions with the third party doctrine. So before the government, the state of Utah or the police could go in and pretty much have access to that information. That was kind of the concern with the third party doctrine. But Utah specifically has come down, is that correct? And basically made it a point to say you're not allowed to get access to something like that without due process of like the warrants and everything. Is that correct?
We certainly work towards trying to ensure that there is, like you're saying, those protections in place. There was a bill that did not pass. We were very glad did not pass on this issue last session, where they wanted to be able to gather DNA at the point of booking. So right now, I believe once you've been charged with a crime, they can get your DNA, and it goes into like the gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but it's the federal registers. Yeah, database. It's Codex, I want to say, or Codex.
Okay.
But at any rate, it goes into that database. They wanted to do that at the time of booking, and then as well, I believe, do covert collecting DNA. So collecting the DNA of someone who is not actually a suspect, but maybe related to a suspect, to try to solve these crimes. And there are concerns with that. I mean, the covert collection in particular, I think is not good.
Yeah.
It's not good.
Business, if you ask me.
Not great. Also not a fan of, this notion of trying to collect DNA at the time of booking, because booking means you're arrested, by the way, just to be clear about our terms here. That means that you've been arrested. So, I mean, just to be completely frank, people are arrested all the time and then not charged with anything, because it just turns out if there's like a brawl somewhere, you're gonna arrest a bunch of people. It's not necessarily clear that you're going to charge everyone with a crime. Now, obviously, I'm not saying it's great to be arrested by law enforcement. I prefer not to be arrested myself, but being arrested is not the same as being a criminal. It's not like that's not necessarily connected, right? You could be arrested and then, oh, everything's fine, right? And think protests. That's a good example of there's often more arrests than there are charges in those kind of situations. So arrest doesn't equal charge, doesn't equal criminal status. So the fact that you've been arrested, therefore we're going to take your DNA and put it in a database just because there was an incident with law enforcement, I don't think is a great way to go. I mean, I have reservations with allowing those who are charged but haven't actually been convicted. So there's a difference between saying you've been convicted of a crime, we're going to take this DNA sample and put it in a database. That's much different than you've just been charged, right? I do take issue with that notion that you should be able to access someone's sort of brand, like put someone's information in a database like that purely because they were charged with a crime prior to conviction. So I do think those are delineations there that are important. But yeah, we were very pleased to see that bill did not pass. We did not support it. We were not thrilled with the language and with what was attempting to be done. So we were glad to see that one fall by the wayside and not make it through the state chambers.
That's good to hear. It's good to know that there's some hope for Utah as far as protecting privacy. So to kind of wrap up, What are some of the things that you are working on upcoming that you can talk about, or that you're willing to share? What are some things that people can look forward to, or just kind of get some insight? How does someone like you fight this? How do you keep working to, I mean, we've talked about you've got some bills that, the team will go fight at the state legislature or whatever, but what are some of your upcoming things that you've got, whether it's writings or projects or, meetings or whatever you can share?
Yes. So we're right now really focusing on geofencing. So so
Yeah,
I
you
was
were on the news for this.
I was interviewed by Jeremy Harris from KUTV, and I'll actually be testifying in committee next week on the issue of geofencing. We're really wanting to impart, or to really impress on legislators the importance of requiring Fourth Amendment protections for these reverse warrants, because these are broad warrants. They are fishing expeditions. This is not us attempting, again, I don't see any real, I think there's an oftentimes unfortunate dichotomy and team sort of playing between those who support law enforcement and those who support these more robust Fourth Amendment protections, of kind of looking at each other as the enemy. And we really don't take that approach. I have no interest in stymieing law enforcement's ability to solve crime, so on and so forth, if they have a warrant based on probable cause that
Right.
that follows the Fourth Amendment. Go access that information. We have no problem with that. The problem is that these warrants, as they're currently being issued and executed, don't meet Fourth Amendment requirements, and that's the problem that we have with them. We don't have like a problem kind of beyond that. So I do want to make that clear on the front end, and then we're really wanting to push that issue forward, and then also we'll be doing some policy briefs this coming year, so look for that later in the fall. I'll be writing a policy brief that touches on a lot of these issues, and hopefully is readable and digestible by the layperson too.
Yeah.
So something that could be a fun read. I'm sure most people want to sit and read a privacy protections policy brief. I know. I
Right.
mean, someone out there does, right? I
Yeah.
mean, someone's got to want to read this, right?
But you do
But
also
it
put
will.
like more online article stuff on the Libertas website, right? They can find more just kind of brief, maybe 2-3 minute read pieces on there as
Yes.
well.
Yes,
So
I get those out on a weekly to bi-weekly basis. And then also I just launched my own website. So
is that officially
look
up?
for that. It went live last night. So it is now a
Congratulations.
thing. So all of my work is published there. There's a short little FAQs that kind of explains a little bit about kind of why I care about privacy, why I care about policy work, and how that fits into my broader philosophy of, like freedom and justice. So it's really
Awesome.
short. Don't worry. This is not
Yeah.
like a thesis out there. It's pretty short.
What's the website called?
It's just my name, lesliecorbly.com. I
Okay.
made it short and simple, but I did name the website. So that's the URL. The website is named The Sovereign Self, which really tries to get at this notion that we all have to sort of take self-ownership of ourselves and our actions, that we're responsible for ourselves. And that's how you build a civil society, is that each individual is responsible for bearing their burden, so to speak, and being responsible for their actions. So again, that's kind of the concept, and you can go read more about it. I put my first blog post up, which actually goes over, I had mentioned that facial recognition reverse search engine.
Yeah.
It talks about that. So yeah, some good
Sweet.
stuff up there that's coming out, and policy brief will be coming. Will be focused primarily on how some of these tools, kind of like what I talked about, some of these tools, we've talked about with like geofencing, can be used also for surveillance and predictive policing, which can become very problematic as far as civil liberties go.
Yeah, awesome. Well,
So
I'll be sure to link to that, to your website and the show
great.
notes and everything. Any final suggestions for people as far as, I mean, this is a great way to finish. You talk about the individual responsibility. What do you suggest people do for just taking initiative to protect themselves, like their digital privacy?
I would really suggest, and I know I don't want this to sound too difficult, because I know it's like a lot of things digitally, you sell yourself out, and I don't mean that in like a pejorative way, but you sort of sell yourself out in a way for convenience and ease and whatnot. And I think that there's a lot that can be done, like on the front end, if you just become more aware of what apps you're using, what settings you have on, things like that, can really help you to start to go, okay, do I really want to have that setting on? Like, think more intentionally, essentially, about your use of technology. Again, I mean, I've done before. I didn't really think a lot about my use of digital technology until, gosh, I want to say it was a couple of years ago. I mean, even in law school, I didn't really pay attention to a lot of that. And I think that's pretty normal. So it's not something that I want, someone to look at themselves negatively for. I think that's pretty natural. But I think thinking intentionally about your use of technology and what apps you're using, why you're using them, do you need to be using them, what's their privacy protections like? So I went stickler and actually deleted Instagram because I read their privacy policy and was like, I don't consent to that. But I was like, no, I don't consent to that. But really think about, like, what are you willing to do and why? And are you willing, right? I mean, it's like, I don't think most people are doing this thought process at all, because it's so much easier to just, right, you're downloading apps, you're out there living life, you're not thinking about worst case scenarios, you're not like studying privacy for fun. Like, no one does that. I get that. Like, I do, but like, that's not, most people are not interested in that, in any of this to that degree, and that's fair. But given where things are going, I do think it's important to take some consideration, kind of some stock of that. And also, for what it's worth, those kind of thinking intentionally is what can drive market changes, right? I mean, we talk about this in the more liberty-based movement, that we tend to be more free market oriented and wanting market solutions to pop up. So if you don't value your privacy in a way, why would companies value it? Right? Because there's different solutions. Like, for instance, if companies don't collect and store certain data, a reverse search warrants get sent and they don't have anything to produce, right? Like, so it's not as if we have to be stuck in this situation where it's constant data mining, right? And I think the public is becoming more aware of the problems associated with data mining and with the algorithmic manipulation that a lot of companies use to try to push products. And, I mean, we all know Google and Facebook and Twitter use algorithms. Like, this isn't news to anyone. They use algorithms to attempt to manipulate. So it's really or to drive content a certain way, right? Or they give you your suggestions based on the algorithm, things of that nature. So it's not like we're really caught having, right? It's like, it doesn't have to be this way just because it is this way now, right? We don't have to maintain the status quo in a way. So that often requires, individuals thinking more deeply and more intentionally about what it is they do and don't want in their lives in the realm of technology. And that I do think that can create niche markets for companies that do care more about privacy and care more about, we don't even collect this data on you, right? We don't even collect it. We don't do any of that, right? And so I think that there's that option is available to everyone. I mean, not everyone can steer, obviously not, it's the rare person who can really steer legislation, but everyone can think very intentionally about what they do and don't want to consent to in their daily lives. And for what it's worth, I do think there needs to be a renewed focus on building tight-knit in-person like communities, right? I think that can be kind of a buffer against some of this and can make you less likely to, at least I've noticed, as my husband and I have begun to live that way more, of really focusing intentionally on the people physically around us. I like find myself, it's weird, like, not even noticing when my phone's not on me for an hour. Do you know what I like not noticing that because there's something else going on that kind of fills that space. And so you're not constantly sort of on a device. And again, this is not meant, I'm not meant to, everyone uses technology differently. That's fine. But some intentionality, I think, could go a long way as far as individuals more tailoring the use of technology and using technology as a tool instead of in a way they're the tool for technology.
Right.
That makes sense. Like, you can it's like you can take ownership of that, and that doesn't have to be a shame-filled process. It's just like you take ownership of it. Like, I decide I can control these things, right? Like, I'm in the driver's seat because I'm the decision maker, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a passive process.
Exactly. Well, great. No, those are all fantastic suggestions. I'm always a fan of, becoming more aware and involved in your own immediate community, because otherwise we're gonna I would put a lot of blame on where we are now, by people's lack of involvement in their own immediate community. But that's a whole other conversation. So, Leslie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you do. Keep up the good work. I'll make sure that I link people to your, the places that you put out your work. I believe you have a Twitter and then your website. So I'll make sure those are up. Um, Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in and sticking through and just taking in all the information. It might be a little bit hard to wrap your head around at first, but this is a very important topic. Privacy in the digital era is something we very much need to be getting ahead of. So keep looking out for the work that Leslie puts out, and just keep up and stay tuned. So until next time, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.